Prime Minister Narendra Modi was in Jakarta this week as part of his three-nation tour of Indonesia, Australia and New Zealand. During the visit, President Prabowo conferred Indonesia's highest civilian honour, the Bintang Adipurna, on PM Modi in recognition of his exceptional contribution to strengthening bilateral ties. The visit marked a significant deepening of the comprehensive strategic partnership with agreements on defense, maritime security, critical minerals, and Indonesia's procurement of BrahMos and Astra missile systems. However, their ties have not always sailed through cordial waters. 6 decades ago, the two Bandung brothers, India and Indonesia, found themselves on opposite sides of a little-known geopolitical controversy. During the 1965 India-Pakistan War, Indonesia under President Sukarno briefly entertained an extraordinary idea that Andaman and Nicobar Islands were an extension of Sumatra and could be wrested from India. Indonesia's menacing threat sent shockwaves through India's diplomatic and military establishments, fearing that a hostile China-Pakistan-Indonesia nexus could open a second maritime front in the Bay of Bengal. 2 years earlier, during a debate in the British House of Lords, Lord Ogmore had warned about Sukarno's growing assertiveness. Drawing comparisons between Sukarno and Italian dictator Mussolini, he remarked, "It is rather bold of him to call the Indian Ocean the Indonesian Ocean." Was it a sudden turn of events that caught India by surprise, or was it the culmination of a series of developments that had steadily worsened relations between India and Indonesia? After all, this was the very country that had once stood shoulder to shoulder with India. Hi, I'm Manya Gupta and welcome to ThePrint. Sukarno, the country's first president, wrote in a letter to Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru on 19 August 1946, "Your country and your people are linked to us by ties of blood and culture which date back to the very beginning of our history. The word India must necessarily always be part of our life, for it forms the very first two syllables of the name we have chosen for our land and our race. It is the Indo in Indonesia." Yet, less than 2 decades later, Indonesia had swung firmly behind Pakistan in the middle of a war. "Down with India, servants of imperialists," and "Kill Shastri" echoed through the streets of Jakarta. The language of ties of blood and culture had turned into something far more worrying. For more than a decade after independence, India and Indonesia shared impeccable bond. When Dutch imperialists threatened to reassert control over Indonesia after the Second World War, Nehru championed Indonesian sovereignty on the global stage. Indonesia was not oblivious to the support. By 1951, this brotherhood had been set in stone through a historic treaty of friendship, promising perpetual peace and unalterable friendship. As newly independent nations carrying fresh wounds of colonial rule, India and Indonesia became architects of New World Order. They pioneered Afro-Asian solidarity at the 1955 Bandung Conference, a watershed moment in India and Indonesian relations, with both countries championing anti-colonialism, non-alignment, and a bulwark against Western military blocs. Beneath the rhetoric of solidarity, however, differences were beginning to emerge by late 1950s. Schisms began with something that had seen the two countries formalize their friendship in the first place, the Bandung Conference. Nehru's refusal to back Sukarno's call for a second conference did not set well with the Indonesian president. Sukarno reacted by rejecting Nehru's primacy within the non-aligned world and began to oppose Nehru at every given opportunity. Sukarno was driven by maritime ambitions and militant anti-colonial rhetoric, which stood in sharp contrast with the more cautious diplomacy associated with Nehru, Joseph Tito of Yugoslavia, and Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt. The growing crisis at home pushed Sukarno towards increasingly ambitious political experimentation. By the early 60s, Sukarno was losing his popularity domestically. The economy was a mess, inflation was soaring, and food shortages had triggered widespread unrest. Within little more than a decade, one of Asia's closest post-colonial partnership had begun to unravel. Anti-India sentiments already ran high in Indonesia post-Asian Games fiasco and New Delhi's support for the Malaysian cause. As India's standing in Jakarta declined, Pakistan masterfully stepped in. Pakistan gave Sukarno exactly what India denied him: full endorsement of Indonesia's demand for a second Bandung conference and unwavering support for Indonesia's West Indian cause and the Crush Malaysia campaign. Pakistan was perceived in Indonesia as far more sensitive and receptive to Indonesian concerns. Its unconditional moral and material support on issues such as West Indian and Konfrontasi, the Indonesia-Malaysian confrontation, resonated deeply in Jakarta. India, meanwhile, was increasingly viewed as aligned with Britain, Australia, and New Zealand, leading to certain sections of Indonesian establishment to see New Delhi as collaborator with Nicolim powers. And the result? Thousands of protesters stormed the Indian embassy, waving banners reading India and Malaysia are Nicolim Siamese twins. Pakistani press, much like today, played a pivotal role in turning the winds in its favor. Newspapers like Dawn praised Sukarno as a revolutionary anti-colonial leader while portraying India as an expansionist new imperialist power bullying smaller neighbors. The joint Indonesia-Pakistani press of April 1964 marked a major breakthrough in Indonesia-Pakistan relationship, which saw Jakarta pivot from its earlier neutrality on Kashmir, calling for an early solution of this dispute in accordance with the people of the state. The year 1965 is largely remembered in India for the war with Pakistan. What has faded from popular memory, though, is the anti-India fury that simultaneously ripped through Indonesia. These sentiments were no longer confined to diplomatic circles. It had spilled onto the streets and was being cheered from the highest offices in Jakarta. Thousands of Indonesian youth and students of Nahdlatul Ulama, the world's largest Islamic organization founded in Indonesia in 1926, flooded the streets carrying banners that read, "Down with Indian imperialists, go home India, crush India." By this time, Indonesia had decisively swung behind Pakistan. While in demonstrations engulfed Jakarta, Indian shops and restaurants were looted. Around 4,000 protesters stormed the Indian embassy in Jakarta, wrecking furniture, shattering windows, and ripping apart the Indian national flag. Subandrio, Indonesia's foreign minister, hailed the embassy attack, calling it revolutionary and describing it as emerging in condemnation of India as an aggressor against Kashmir and Pakistan. Even Sukarno publicly expressed his sympathy, declaring that the prayers of the Indonesian people are dedicated to the people in Pakistan, fighting fiercely to maintain the sovereignty and freedom of their country and people. Tit-for-tat protests rang through both capitals. Deep resentment and outrage reverberated in New Delhi. Demonstrators staged protests outside the Indonesian embassy in New Delhi, burning effigies of Sukarno. The perceived insult of India's national honor sparked uproar in parliament. Opposition leaders staged protests and demanded that New Delhi sever all diplomatic ties and recall Indian mission. However, External Affairs Minister Swaran Singh rejected those demands and arguing it would not be in India's interest to do so. Every day, the headlines blared the new reality. An editorial in the Indian Express titled Dictator's Access reported that Sukarno had offered to send 5,000 volunteers to bolster Pakistan's war efforts. Another headline, Jakarta Aid for Pindi, blogged, revealed that Jakarta had urged Ceylon, a friendly Commonwealth nation, to grant access to its airports to ferry Indonesian personnel to Pakistan. Reports of direct military assistance followed. An article in The Hindu dated 20 September 1965 carried the headlines Indo-Plains and East Pakistan. For New Delhi, the implications were alarming. Swaran Singh issued a stern warning that active hostility from Indonesia in alliance with China and Pakistan would be regarded as aggression against India and will be dealt accordingly. Indian ambassador to the United States, Braj Kumar Nehru, rushed to meet President Lyndon Johnson on 9 September 1965. He described a clear Chinese-Pakistani-Indonesian understanding designed to put a triple squeeze on India. If China entered the conflict, he asked, what would we do? India thought that Indonesian contribution might be to take Andaman and Nicobar Islands. India couldn't stop this. It had no navy. Johnson's reply was blunt. This was giving us grey hairs right now. Located at the eastern edge of Indian Ocean and close to the Malacca Strait, Andaman and Nicobar Islands, India's unsinkable aircraft carrier, occupied a strategic position far beyond their size. Given the proximity of the islands to Sumatra, Indonesia's westernmost province, fears of Indonesian incursions were more real than distant rumor. And Indonesia had the capability to act. Admiral Arun Prakash, former Chief of Naval Staff of India, had told ThePrint that President Sukarno had declared that the Indian Ocean should be called the Indonesian Ocean. The Indonesian Navy had reportedly even printed charts referring to it as Indonesian Ocean. By the early 60s, Indonesia had acquired a fairly formidable naval capability from the Soviets, including cruisers, submarines, missile boats, well before the Indian Army began its own major buildup. Around 1961-62, Indonesian Navy was viewed as a significant regional force. Indonesia did eventually offer Pakistan a submarine and a patrol boat during the 65 war, though by the time they reached Karachi, a ceasefire had already come into effect, he further told. Apprehensions of a possible Indonesian takeover of the islands filled the halls of power as well as military ranks. In parliament, Colonel Bashir Hussain Zaidi, member of the Rajya Sabha, sounded the alarm about dangers to the islands, pointing specifically to Indonesia's lethal submarine fleet. MP Hari Vishnu Kamath was more direct and said that though the defense minister is not admitting to it, it was clear that the submarine noticed near the Nicobar Islands belonged to Indonesia. Such apprehensions were not baseless. Indonesia had thrown its weight behind Pakistan during the 65 war, supporting it with all its military might. While no direct military action was taken against India, several reports indicated Indonesian aircrafts carrying out demonstration flights over the islands. Sukarno declared ideas of Indonesian Ocean coupled with these developments caused justifiable alarm in India. Was there any substance behind these fears? One account from Pakistani side suggests there was. In his memoir, The First Round, Air Marshal Asghar Khan, Commander-in-Chief of the Pakistani Air Force, recounts a conversation that he had with Indonesian Naval Chief Admiral Marta Dinata. Khan noted that Admiral Marta Dinata had asked him, "Don't you want us to take over the Andaman Islands?" A look at the map will show that the Andaman and Nicobar Islands are an extension of Sumatra, are in any case between East Pakistan and Indonesia. What right have the Indians to be there? In any case, the Indonesian Navy will immediately commence patrols of the approaches to these islands. Many argue these alleged claims were an offhand remark made in the heat of rapidly escalating war rather than a genuine strategic objective. It was less about a genuine territorial ambition and more of a calculated gamble to stretch Indian military resources and divide its attention. Indonesian assertions about Andaman and Nicobar Islands were in line with the pattern of aggressive maritime posturing. In his book, Transition to Triumph, Vice Admiral Gulab Mohanlal Hiranandani records his conversations with Admiral Bhaskar Sadashiv Soman, who was assigned the responsibility for the defense of Andaman and Nicobar Islands in 62 after the Indo-Chinese conflict, offering a revealing glimpse from within the Indian naval establishment. Looking back, Admiral Soman admitted to have felt an unease about the island's vulnerability, given reports of Sukarno keeping an eye on the Bay Islands. It was clear to him that any combined naval forces of Pakistan and Indonesia would not be against the Indian mainland, but most likely will be for the capture of these islands. This perceived Indonesian threat to the Andaman and Nicobar Islands shaped India's entire wartime naval posture, and that was a key reason why Indian Navy remained in the Bay of Bengal during the 65 war. Yet the feared Indonesian move never materialized. The ceasefire between India and Pakistan came before Indonesia could actually act. But the more complete answer lay in what happened inside Indonesia itself. On 30 September 1965, as the war was winding down, a coup attempt shook Jakarta. Major General Suharto moved to suppress it and steadily stripped Sukarno of power, becoming president by 1965. Sukarno's maritime challenge to India over the Indian Ocean and the Andaman Islands was aborted entirely because the coup forced Jakarta to pull its navy back and drop its aggressive posture. The officers who had been loudest in their hostility towards India, among them Admiral Marta Dinata, the same man who had spoken of seizing the Andamans, and Air Marshal Omar Dani, was swept out in the purge that followed. Sukarno's confrontational foreign policy collapsed with his regime, and Indonesian Ocean was eventually forgotten. Today, relations between the two countries have sailed far beyond the turbulence of the 1960s, evolving into a robust, comprehensive strategic partnership, sharing centuries-old civilizational ties and common concerns in the Indo-Pacific. Both countries now view each other as key maritime partners, collaborating on maritime security, connectivity, counterterrorism, and maintaining a free, open, rules-based Indo-Pacific order. Bilateral trade has risen from $4.3 billion in 2005 to nearly $30 billion in 2023. Defense exercises such as Garuda Shakti and Samudra Shakti and coordinated patrols deepen engagement across multiple fronts. Indonesia's official entry into BRICS in 2025 has given fresh momentum to the partnership, opening avenues for deeper strategic cooperation and shared voice on global platforms. Thank you, and keep watching ThePrint.